Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So in order to develop co-design, I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about methods of co-design. And for some of you that it will seem obvious, and for others of you it will be new. So it's so we can just do in a co-design workshop, you can literally just have some discussion. That's not a bad thing to do. Just get people talking, get people to know each other. You could maybe do some sketching of ideas. You can do storyboards. You can actually prototype. You can go beyond prototype to full mock-ups. You can do mind mapping. You can do role plays. So you could ask people to play different roles and see how it shows out. You can just play games. Games can be great fun, especially if you're working with children. But we are all children at heart, so we do like games, even if we tend to be very serious. So games can be good. You can do play acting, so people just play in different ways. You can do storytelling, and you can do something called fictional inquiry, which is what we talked about before, which is where you give somebody a fictional idea and then they come up with some stories around that idea. So I just thought I'd point a few of these out. There's me eating probably that chocolate in front of me. So this is some discussion. So this was at a co-design session where I was a participant. And that's just the 5 of us chatting together as we co-design, right? And so that's perfectly valid. Another thing, and I've taken this from Sanders and Stapers, is maybe co-create a workflow. So you might together have some bits of paper or something, and you're beginning to get people, different actors, to say how they might, what's the workflow of something. So a classic example in assistive technology is, for example, if you guys are developing a new hearing aid, it's great that you're developing this nanotechnology, that's brilliant, but at some point it's got to go to market. And at some point, somebody's got to purchase it, somebody else has got to then fit it, somebody else has then got to use it. So from a user point of view, you might do a co-create the workflow. You might do that with people who are deaf, who are hearing aid users, low hearing. And so you might get 4 or 5 hearing aid users together and say, I want to sketch out, how did you get your hearing aid, the life cycle of your hearing aid? And they might go, oh, I heard about it from a friend, and they told me to go to this shop. And somebody else might say, oh, did you go to that shop? I didn't go to that shop. I actually got it through a hospital. So at one point you've got a branch. Oh, I went here, I went to a hospital. And then someone might say, well, mine broke. Oh, it broke. Okay, what happened to it? Well, I had to go back to this thing. And so you'd be going, okay, so they had to go back, right? And then somebody else might say, well, the batteries ran out and I couldn't get replacements. Or how did you get, oh, Amazon delivered replacements. As you sketch this, and eventually I had to get it retuned. My hearing got worse and it stopped working. And the same way I really do need a new pair of glasses. I've been saying it for 6 months, but things change. Or I changed jobs, and actually I needed it to be changed because it was hearing. I just kept picking up the noise of some machine really loudly, so I needed that noise to be taken away, so I had to go back to the audiologist. And you'd get this lovely workflow of like how somebody, or a user journey maybe more than a workflow. And then with the workflow, you might talk to the audiologist about how do they tune the hearing aid. So what's the workflow that they use to do that? What software, how do they interact with the software? How does it work? Where do you, which bits work well? And there might be bits of the software that work very poorly. Like, well, we tried to do this, but it was always annoying. There's always like a hack to everything. So I don't mean to call out Microsoft, but I still use a lot of Microsoft products. But there are so many things I've learned to hack in Microsoft Word so that they do the things that I want them to do. So simple things like highlighting. I like to highlight in a different color, but you can never get it to choose a different color beyond the 9 colors it gives you. But if you highlight text in that color, then that color will appear as a highlighting color, right? I don't know why, but I figured out that it worked one day, and so now I've used it. So audiologists will have similar hacks, won't they, to their software. So you want to know their hacks so that you make the software interface better for them, even though you've produced the hardware. So you also just do sketching. So if people have ideas, try and get people sketching. Now, you paint, so you probably will be fine with sketching. Some people are terrified. I mean that, right? You give them a blank piece of paper and a pen, and it's like you've asked them to give an acceptance speech at, the Emmys or the Grammys. They're just like, no, you don't understand, I can't draw. It's like asking people to sing, right? I can't, you don't understand, I don't dance, I can't sing, I can't do that. So sometimes if you know a particular thing, let's say a hearing aid, you could, for example, have some some pictures. Like you could start a piece of paper with a person. You've got a person, and then you might have a hearing aid, like this. And you might ask people, you might have some like templates, and just have a couple of things where people can see that that's a person. It doesn't look like a great person, right? But what you're asking them to do is maybe just add some expression to that person to start. So is the person happy or sad? Or they're very happy because they've just got a hearing aid and it works. How do you show it works? We give it a tick. And you give them something to break the ice, and then begin to realize that it's okay, that sketching doesn't, you're not asking you to become Picasso. I'm just saying, just draw what you think, because it's just a way of communicating. So if we do sketching, that's good. And then storyboards are great. So this is going back to that workflow, but more in a storyboard analysis, where these are really good for breaking the ice in sketching as well, because you can give people a template with the squares, and they've got 5 squares, and they've got to put a bit of the story in 5 squares, which helps people with structure rather than a blank page. It's like starting your thesis with a blank page. It's just that terrifying blank page. So you can say, for example, here we've got someone going to post something, they see something, they decide to open their mobile phone, they decide to scan something, decide to do something, and it's quite easy to point out the different bits of the workflow. Or for example, you can also do things where if people have brought photographs with them, not that you want to destroy their photographs, but you can tell them to put photographs into the storyboard, and then you can have pens where people can sketch over it. And that can be much easier. So like if they had a problem with this bit, so you draw a mobile phone into a hand, for example. So you can have some photos that people have brought in, but you can also take some generic photographs. For example, if you're going to design something with a mobile phone, I might just take a photograph of me holding a phone. Does that make sense? And then just make this, just Photoshop the cover out, and people could put whatever they wanted onto that. So it will make people feel like they've done much better sketching, even though they're just drawing the interface. So you can do things like that where and you print it. The important thing there is to print those photographs at like a 50% transparency. If they're too bold, then you can't sketch over them. But you want to make them sort of just in the background, and then you can sketch over them. You can also do some paper prototyping, which is great fun. Loads of Post-it notes, scissors, and just get people to sketch out. This is really good for interface design as well, because people can move bits, and I don't want the go button here. There's a piece of AAC software called Grid4, and a guy who uses Grid4 came to give a guest lecture to my students. and I was looking at his interface for Grid4. And so if you imagine this entire screen is the grid, right? And so he's using an eye tracker to look, and here's the keyboard. And then there's some icons up here, which are sort of shortcut keys. And in this interface, there must be, I would say, 200 keys here, right? And about 20 different things here. And just down here, there's a tick for enter, for return. And right next to it, here, is delete. I'm not joking. They've put delete. I mean, I'm tracking with my eyes, and this is a $10,000 piece of equipment, and they've put the delete button, A, twice as big as the return button, and B, right next to it. I mean, if they had just done a little bit of paper prototyping, it would have been a really obvious thing that people would be like, don't put that button there, let's put it over there. You know, so things like that can be easily moved around without you needing to rebuild the architecture behind the scenes. It also helps if you want to, this is quite a nice idea down here. We use this quite a lot where this is I'm not sure if you can see it so well on that video, but this is a piece of cardboard. Oops, so I keep hitting the delete button. That's a piece of cardboard with a hole cut out. And this is a piece of paper which you run through the back between another piece of paper here. And so you can sort of, as people move screens, you can just move the screen along. And so you can prototype an entire app just with a piece of paper. And so people don't need to be computer scientists. They don't need to be UX designers. We just want to know what do they want to do in each bit. And then they can design the app for us. And okay, we might have to change the architecture in the background, but we now know what the experience that they want to have is. So you can then move up to low fidelity prototypes. So I showed you this one yesterday as well, but we went to that co-design session where we had 3D printed some wheelchairs because we were designing something for wheelchairs. So it meant we assumed we'd need wheelchairs. And then people were We had bits of Lego, so people put a little bit of, we had foam core board, and the foam core board was just meant to be for us putting, because it was in a room that we didn't own, so it was meant to be for us to pin the pieces of paper and the designs to, so that we didn't ruin the walls of the place we were in. But this team just cut it up and started making an adaptive prototype with some bits of, some bits of Lego here, and then some little bits of, that was a transparent overlay that we had, which just had some papers in, and they started cutting that up. So people can quickly turn a sketch into a low fidelity prototype, and that helps you think about some basic functions. And obviously you can do that in, say, CAD. So if you've done mechanical engineering, like any of us can probably open up CAD models and we could change things. But when you're co-designing, you can't do CAD. You can't teach people CAD drawing in 20 minutes. And also, you don't get the feel of it, you know? So that tactileness, we do take a lot of feedback as humans to that tactile interfaces. So, yeah, so we've got 3D printed wheelchair, which we combined with crafting materials. And places like India are actually probably much richer in crafting materials. So you've probably got a great wealth just in that shop. What was it called? They had crafting materials in there. And this was a bit of fabric. I don't know where the piece of fabric came from, but people were thinking you could just have a piece of fabric that could move. So people were looking at different props. And then afterwards, we obviously developed that sliding transfer board as well. The other thing that people were talking about was how do you prioritize things? And so in co-design, not as engineers, but in co-design, when we want to prioritize things, a very common thing is, you must have done this before, you get stickers, and you've got to put stickers on things. Now, it's both good and bad, stickers. So we did this recently for GDI Hub, and there was an idea that I had for like what we should do for the next thing, part of GDI Hub. And loads of people have given me a red sticker that they think it's a really bad idea. And I know why they think it's a bad idea, because it's a lot of work. But I still want to do it, so I'm going to do it anyway. So the voting system is like, all I know now is I've got to convince people more. Does that make sense? Like, I'm going to have to work harder at convincing people. But in proper co-design, I would have accepted that defeat, and I would have walked away, but I haven't. So they don't know that yet. But I wasn't really, but in this case, for example, you'll see that the first thing when you're doing the voting is, the tricky thing I find with the voting is that let's just say I give you some post-it notes, they're all up on the wall, all random ideas, and you've all got some stickers. And what will happen generally is you'll all stand there feeling a bit awkward, not wanting to be the first person to put the stickers on, and then somebody will be the first person. And those ones will attract other dots. Does that make sense? Because if you were already deciding between two, that one and another one, most people go, oh, they get tempted by the one that's already been voted on. So sometimes what I do, apart from just going on and putting stickers on, is maybe just ask people, like number the post-it notes. Does that make sense? And as people are sitting around, tell them to go around and to go back to their desks or like their area and just write down the numbers of the post-it notes they would pick. And then we go round the table and we have somebody putting the dots on. Does that make sense? And then people get to explain why they chose them as well. That can be a way of overcoming that sort of, sort of flocking to the wrong thing. You can also do role plays. So you can have silly props, like this is a television screen, and so you're on television doing something. But you can do silly things like that help bring you out of yourself to do things. So. And then finally, you can have play acting. So this is some work, and I've seen similar work that is often done with people. It's a technique that's often used actually with older people and designing living spaces for older life. So as we retire, because building structures are expensive, aren't they? You don't want to build a prototype building structure and then move walls around. Whereas if you have a model house, you can ask people what sensors they might like in which room. No, I wouldn't like to have the bedroom right next to the kitchen, or I would like to have, so people could move things around and talk about how they're doing. And they can almost show you as well a life, you can mock up their house. So you could have visited them, you could see their house, you could mock up that space, and you could ask them, can you show, this is you, little small you, can you show us how you move about your house and what's your problems? And they say, oh, getting out of bed, oh, that's my pain. And then I I want to go and do here, but I always need the toilet first. And then sometimes I forget my medication because it's in the, and they sort of talk around it and you get an idea of their life. So, and then storytelling, which I've already mentioned, is a collective participatory design technique that provides an approach that allows designers to shape the context of collaborative design activities. So it allows you to give a ring fence to what you want to talk about. Like, I want to talk about IIT campus physical accessibility, or I want to speak about, what technologies will IIT Madras develop for for people with disabilities in 2025 or 2050. Now, if I say technologies, you'll all come up with very different ideas than if I say built environment. You'd say very different ideas if I said in New York versus in Chennai. You'd say different ideas if I said visually impaired people versus people with dementia. So those context bits as a researcher you can set, but you also give everybody then freedom within that playground to play. And it sort of tries to bypass existing social cultural structures. So yeah, so rather than, it's trying to break people out of you sitting there thinking, oh, well, I'm a PhD student, I'm a faculty member. So you might not be a faculty member at 2050. You might have decided, or you might not be a faculty member in 1 year, you don't know, like you might decide to go into industry. Or you might be in industry, but by 2050, it stops you thinking about your particular role in this particular time and more just the general context. So this is some ideas of these are like handwritten storytelling that people have then developed. So you put people in small groups, normally 2 or 3. One person is a note taker, and they sort of create the story together. So when we were thinking about all of those techniques, which one would we pick for Kibera? What do we think? Any of those spring to mind? Can you remember them all? I'm not sure if I thought I might have put them all. Yeah. It's tricky, isn't it?
They all seem like good ideas.
That's one of the issues, right? They all seem like, yeah. So maybe if you go back to the research questions, we wanted to know how people are using phones. So that sort of ruled out a little bit, but we wanted to know what they'd like in the future. So we could do prototyping, you could do, there's lots of things, right? So we ended up with fictional design fiction. So the first thing we did was we brought people. So in an ideal world, we would have gone to Kibera and run it in Kibera, but there wasn't really a space to run it. It was quite hard to find a place that we would be able to run it that we'd have everything we needed. So we decided to run it in the KBTA offices because they knew KBTA and they felt an affiliation to KBTA. They'd always helped them, so we felt they would feel safe there. We tried to make it fun. We brought chocolates from the UK. That's always a good idea. Individual wrapped chocolates and sweets, because that's just gets people excited to be there. We brought lots of stuff like Play-Doh, because we're working with partially sighted people. We wanted it to be really bright. So for those that had some color perception, they would be able to see the differences. And also Play-Doh, tactile interfaces. It has been shown, even if you're totally blind, you can make tactile interfaces. You can co-design something. So we had lots of tactile things, but we also looked at storytelling. So we did these 2 exercises. The first was a modeling activity, and this is what we told people to do. In this exercise, imagine you are still, so we start with storytelling activity first, so it follows the other way around. Imagine we are in the future. It is 50 years from now, and a baby is born. The baby is visually impaired. At this time, the world has everything in place for visually impaired people. It is all affordable to everyone, so this child will have everything she or he needs to live an independent life. Tell us the story of her or his life. What did she or he become, and how did that happen? Tell us about his or her parents and their community. How do they find out what exists to help their child? Work in your group to create a story. Pick one person, write it down. You can use a braille machine or slate or pen and paper. So we had all of the different ways that people could give the technology. And then once they'd done that, we said, okay, now we're still in the future. It's still 50 years from now, but your job is to design one or more of the tools that you think you might find here. So one of the technologies that you think might exist that makes the world accessible. So these tools which help visually impaired people to live independent lives, to go to school, to work, to participate fully in society, use clay, cards, stickers, use anything you like to make your design. So in the storytelling activity, here's the example. I think I can read this. Anne was born in Matheri slums. She was born visually impaired. Luckily for her, her parents had information about visually impaired persons, so life was good for them. The community too had exposure to people with disabilities and had all necessary requirements for people with disabilities. So the parents and community did not they weren't treated differently. Then they've got some examples. So Donata was saying like the parents will take the child to the hospital and they will be given the information on where to take the child to learn to be educated. For example, learn to be Braille. Parents will know where the rehabilitation is and know where to find them. They'll be able to, from a very early age, have everything that they needed. And one of this particular group, one of the big concerns that they had was that for their life, they only found out about anything that could help them when they got to about 18 or 20. So all of their childhood had sort of been lost. So in school, they had just sat there, not participating, or they hadn't had any way of participating. So they were very focused on everything would just be early intervention and seamlessness, right? So you wouldn't, and then they would tell stories about, well, you go to try and get this device, but for this device, you have to go to this place, and this device, you have to go to this place. And then when I need to see the eye person, I have to go to this hospital. And it's like, there's 19 different places, and those 19 different places are all accessible by one bus out of Kibera, which is expensive and only runs on a very strict timetable, and they have to give up work to be able to go, but there's 19 different places, so it's all quite complicated. So they were saying, no, everything will be in the slum. It will just be there, right? Everybody will be there. I'll just be able to get the information. It will all be very easy. And in the modelling activity, they came up with some really, really good ideas. I'm not sure if I've got another slide. Yeah, so here's some slides of what they came up with. So for example, one was accessible road crossing. So I don't know if you've ever been, have you been to informal settlements? Have you visited informal settlements? Like on the Madras on the campus here, people don't seem to really pay any attention to whether or not you're already turning right or left. People just keep going where they're going, but everybody sort of goes slowly enough that it doesn't matter. Does that make sense? In Kibera, it's like that, only imagine the density of people is 10 times as many people. So, and everybody's moving as if their life depended on it. Does that make sense? Everybody's moving really quickly. So you can imagine like trying to cross a road when there's lots of different moving traffic, different people crossing in different places is really hard. And a lot of the people hadn't really left Kibera that often, and yet they came up with the idea of a smart road crossing. Like that their white cane, as they approached the road crossing, it would notice that they were blind, it would speak to the road, the crossing would immediately stop for them, it would give them more time, they had these like audio signs, it would explain to people this is a blind person crossing, so take time. And so some of these technologies already exist. I'm not sure they would have heard of them. Does that make sense? Considering most of these people didn't realize that their phone spoke to them, if that makes sense. But they came up with some very, very good ideas, like wearables. They had wearable ideas that you would just have a sensor that would tell you things as you walked along. Like if you were passing a person that you knew, it would tell you, because there's lots of people, so you just want it to recognize the one person you know. And when you think about some of the technologies that are being developed for blind people at the moment, and some of them do use computer vision to like map things out, but when I've tested a few of them, my biggest problem, and I'm not blind, so I don't process audio as well, but my biggest thing is, can you stop telling me everything? Because one of the things with sight is, of course, although we see everything, our brain doesn't process it all. Does that make sense? Like once you're all staying roughly the same, my brain's not constantly processing that desk is going to move. It just knows that there are these desks. Does that make sense? Whereas with the audio, it just keeps telling me, there are 20 people in front of you sitting in front of there are 20, on your left, there is a restaurant. There are 5 restaurants. There are 5 restaurants. There are 5, and you're like, oh my God, I just, please stop. Whereas their idea of just tell me if they were like, I only want to know if I know somebody. Well, yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? Because that is, if you're walking through a crowd, you pretty much don't notice people unless really they're a threat to you, you're scared, or you know them, or they just look really out of context and you're just a bit like, wow, there's a...
One more thing that we discussed yesterday, that there are other senses that are very powerful in people who cannot see. Whereas when these audios keep on playing,
Yeah.
That thing will get subsided, right?
Yes.
Their attention, their sense of smelling, and all things that are helping them in other ways.
Yeah.
That will not be used to their full potential.
Yeah, I think there needs to be a bit more research on how people process those audios as you're walking through, because I wonder if you used, so oftentimes when I've trialed those technologies, it's been in tech fairs or at, I don't know, a Microsoft office where I'm there for a day and somebody's showing me this technology. But I wonder if you use it every day, if your brain would naturally process that stuff out. So, you know, like if you're doing, I know some people I know, I grew up in a very busy, like I grew up in nursing homes, very busy environment. So I was always used to doing homework or something where it was really noisy. There was lots of people coming and going. I didn't need a quiet space. And I remember when I first went to a library, it was like the silence was almost too much for me to study. I was used to lots of noise, and then I could study. So I do wonder if, as people, if you heard that level of audio all the time, would your brain learn to process it? Does that like learn to sort of dull it a bit? Or is it the fact that because it's constantly new information, as you're moving, it's very difficult to do, and so actually we need a processing layer in between? So I think those kind of things, now that the technologies are becoming available and they actually work, we can begin to run those kind of longitudinal studies. And also, if you ran those studies, it'd be quite interesting to run those studies alongside some brain scan activity to understand, maybe like some FNIRS, you know, so near-infrared spectroscopy, so you could actually see which bits of the brain are lighting up when and what intensity, and then you could begin to see over time, does the processing amount, you know, reduce? So there's, yeah.
The same thing happened when we tested out with the screen readers. It was giving out so much additional information that the users didn't need. So what they suggested was like, if we had a possibility of talking with the machine, like just stop telling the titles of the PDFs, just go to the content, so it'll be more useful. So that there was no two-way communication between the user and the.
There is this idea a lot in assistive technology that there's like a one size fits all, but we, in other technologies, we make things our own, don't we? So that, I don't know, you have your own bookmarks bar in a browser, for example. So I think that sometimes there are these intermediate, some of the screen readers you can set things, or I think most people become what I would call power users, and they learn all of the shortcut keys, you know, so they learn all the shortcut keys, and so it gets to the heading, they skip. But actually, the other interesting thing I think is, well, this is getting on to universal design and accessibility, but just for a second, one of the things I think is quite interesting is that, say for web design, a lot of what we do now is we have websites, and then we make sure they're screen reader accessible. So what do? We put alt text with images, we make sure that headings are tagged so that it will read it in order, we make sure that the order is read. But I'm not convinced that it always gives the equivalent experience. Does that make sense? So for example, if your website is very image rich, you'll have that there's an awful lot of information being given by that image that if you describe the image, you don't fully get. Does that make sense? And actually, an equivalent document might have been very different to the website. Does that make sense? So what we've done is made sure that you can access the information, which is absolutely right. But equally, one of the things I've been talking about actually with Chris Patno from Google, I've been saying to him recently that in my head, in the future, there would be this idea of an axis on accessibility, which would have text to video, to sort of image rich. And so, for example, if you're so if you just think about social media, Instagram, very image rich. I know Twitter or X, very text based generally, right? But the way you consume information, so let's say I want to know, you've just done a really great research paper on something, and I want to know more about your paper, and I'm me. So if I'm me, I'm quite dyslexic, so it's much better for me to hear your paper, mostly, and then I will read it, and it will be easier for me. But, so I'd far prefer to get like an audio overview of the paper. Does that make sense? So I sort of know what's coming. But when I really want to understand the detail, I will read your paper. Does that make sense? Because I don't process everything through audio, and therefore I need to read and write, actually, to really understand something, right? So I would use those two modalities. Also, that would change in the context. So if I'm walking my dog, I'd love to have a whole series of short audios that explains these things to me, that I'd be walking around, I'd be listening to those. I think that's the paper I now want to read. I'd be able to flag it. And actually, if I then go from walking the dog and me and dog get on the bus, I'd like to be able to pull out my iPad, and that I'm no longer reading text, I'm reading the whole thing. Does that make sense? Whereas other times I might want to think about just like an image-based version would be a lot better. And so you'd have things that rather than it's like, well, we're now designing for visually impaired people, we're now designing for dyslexic people, we're now designing for non-dyslexic, non-visually impaired people. We're actually just designing for people who either want text-based information and text-based short or audio information, and picking out the modality, which is this, it's a multimodal interaction, which you then decide, I want the easy use case, the hard use case. And also it would learn your context, right? So you might not like to read on a bus. It might make you sick, for example. You might get car sick or motion sickness. So you like audio on the bus. I don't get motion sickness and I like to read on a bus. So, so it would just swap the modalities out rather than having to constantly build for those deficits that we keep sort of retrofitting. That's my dream. So the other thing we did to try and do this idea of co-design, getting back to co-design, is we tried to make the whole process co-designed. And so one of those things was to make sure that Wycliffe and Gabrielle, who were the two local researchers, were co-authors of the paper, because they helped us understand the context. They conducted the interviews. They took the photographs. Interestingly, it was an absolute nightmare to get them as authors. Not because they wouldn't want to be authors, but because the PCS, the new precision conference software system, you had to have an email address. Like, you don't exist without an email address. So we had, so you'll see that they have, where are they? They've got these Gmail accounts that we set. I'm just making up accounts for them. I'm WhatsApping them and saying, I need to make an account for you, is that okay? so they have these email addresses that nobody's ever going to use, just so that they could be added to the system. But it just demonstrates an inherent bias within our world that we assume an email address is something that everybody will have, when actually a lot of people don't have or need one. We also wanted to make sure that the participants got the information back. So we translated it to Kiswahili. Well, we didn't. The University of Nairobi translated a sort of a user-friendly version of the results. So what did we find? How, what does it mean for them? What would be the next steps? And we did a dissemination activity where everybody came in together, and this was shared with them, and we had a conversation about how we would move forward. And so one of the things that really came out through that co-design process of the future interactions was the idea of supported and independent interactions. So in nearly all of the things that, the claim models and the descriptions that people spoke about, there was one big description, two stories that really focused on this visually impaired person that would be born in Kibera, and they would go to university and they would become a doctor for the local area. And so there was this idea of the supported interactions not being the other people supporting the disabled person, but nearly all of the future technology, the future scenarios had this young disabled person would grow up, and they would be supporting other people to learn about technology, right? So, and that didn't exist at all in the current situation. So when we did the current situation, no blind and partially sighted person was helping to develop technology or helping others with technology, but all of them wanted future people to be able to do that. And then a lot of it was about independent interactions, so clear focus on navigation. So one of their biggest challenges was navigation. So the idea of they're happy to be part of a community and have that community, but really it would be nice to be able to choose when you have it and be able to independently navigate. Well, in that case, maybe just going to the toilet. That even if they need the toilet, they need to ask somebody. If they're going to the shop, they need to ask somebody. It gets quite tiresome. Yep, so the stories and the artifacts developed by participants highlighted the following themes, from mobiles to the idea of distributed interactions. So there was lots of things where the technology would speak to people. It would be, we would distribute all of the different technologies across the infrastructure as well as the physical infrastructure. The idea of technology for navigation came up time and time again. The idea of social acceptance, not healing. So there would be lots of sentences that would say things like, and the person would grow up to be integrated into society, and they would not be told they needed to heal. None of the stories had sight was cured. They could have done, right? They could have said, in 2050, blind and partially sighted people wouldn't exist because we would have found a way to give everybody sight, or they would have robotic sight, or they would have, nobody wanted that. They didn't think for 1 second that would be a thing that maybe they couldn't imagine it, but they definitely didn't think about it. Does that make sense? We definitely didn't hear it. Lots of access to information, as you saw from the story I read out, just that people would get information at the right time. Lots of two-way support and achieving life goals and prominent roles in community. And a lot about where people would sit in terms of social structure. So overall, the conclusions from the study, it's a very small study. It was only 7 people, and then about 11 people who took part in the co-design. Mobile phones is not just, it's a social enabler, and it's an assistive technology. You can have direct, supported, dependent, or restricted interactions currently. Accessibility barriers always result in exclusion of the visually impaired person, and that participants' aspirations are for more balanced interactions where support is both received and given. It's not that they are always the recipients of this care. So one of the things that happened during that study was Mohammed, he asked me, he's one of the participants, and he asked me, what makes you different from everybody else? I've said this before to Roshni, to a talk last week. And it stayed with me, it still stays with me. So I still, sometimes I'm going to sleep and I can still see him, because he was a young man, young Muslim man who was really delighted that his latest unit where he lived was really near the mosque. It really made him happy. But he didn't, like, here I was, we were asking these questions, and I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, oh, you know, you people, you come, you ask us questions, you write reports, you go away, nothing changes. So, you know, what's going to be different? And the truth is that what we did wasn't perfect, especially because when we finished this study, COVID hit almost immediately. So a lot of the things we would have gone on to implement genuinely didn't happen, because then we lost momentum and things didn't happen. But we really did try hard to think about this handover research. We did our very best to do research training of the local people, of the KBTA team, but also of the local researcher. We did our best to make sure that the collaborations with the local universities were strong and that they would be able to conduct such a study again without us in it, because these were oftentimes mobile phones and rehabilitation, they're not seen together. So the people we were working with would have been rehabilitation experts and social workers, and they would never have thought before that mobile phones should be investigated as part of the ecosystem. So they were learning how to, and they would never have thought of these techniques because they're clinicians, and they would have thought more of experiments. So we wanted to make sure that these things worked well. Yeah, we made sure that DPOs did a lot of the work. We made sure that the feedback went to the participants in their language, so at least they would understand what had happened. And we tried to build a program of research rather than an individual project, so that if at any point in time the funding gets cut, there's some local capacity to keep it going. But like I said, it's not perfect. So these are the guys who are brilliant, but they were there. And one of the things that led to, at this time, it was just a study, right? And we did the study. And there's another case study, which when I share the slides, I'll keep it in. It's right at the end of this deck. But it's a very similar study that we did with wheelchair users. And basically, the headline of that is that the wheelchair, like a lot of the physical infrastructure was so bad for wheelchair users that the mobile phone acted as an accessibility bridge. It allowed them to call for people to come and help them maybe they would sometimes often need to be carried from their home to the main road, for example, because the roads would be there's too narrow to get a wheelchair down, or it was rainy season and it was too wet to be able to wheel. And then once they were on the road, they would be okay. But also things could come to them, and they could keep in contact when they were isolated, right? So that was the wheelchair headlines. So we had done these 2 small studies, and we previously did that work with GSMA and the Clinton Health Access Initiative on the product narrative. And then, if I'm honest, it went a bit dead, this side of the project. COVID hit. I wanted to do more mobile, but there was so much, so many real problems with COVID. Does that make sense? And just access to basic healthcare and things like that, that this bit of the project sort of, just sort of dipped, and we didn't do much. And then Chris Patno started at Google, and I showed him this research, and I was talking to him one day about, really think that we need to demonstrate that mobiles are an assistive technology. And he was flying off to see Pascal from At Scale the few days later in Geneva. And so him and Pascal decided, actually, because he asked Pascal, well, when you're talking to governments, do they fund mobile phones as an assistive technology? In India, for example, have a scheme, but from what I can tell, the bureaucracy of getting the phone is quite impressive. And you can only get one type of phone, right? So did you want to add something? Or no. So I think it's like, although a scheme exists, I mean, there are similar schemes in the UK. It's not to single out India, but normally, when somebody's giving something which is perceived as a high value thing, anybody puts an awful lot of process in the way, and then people don't use it because it's too difficult to get. So anyway, he was going up there. Pascal said, no, this sounds really exciting. We'd love to do this. So we managed to get, because one of the other problems with aid money is, imagine I want to give 2,000 phones to people, because that's what I really wanted to do. I was like, let's just give 1,000 phones, let's see how people use it, let's get a large scale study done so that we can really because these like small insights, how do we build on that, like get real data? But I would have to track every asset. I can't tell you how much, I would just lose the will to live. I don't want to track 2,000 phones. And also I just feel like that would invalidate the research, right? Because if I'm asking you to tell me how you use your phone, what you use it for, but I'm also saying, and I'm also tracking how you use that phone, and if it gets lost, you know, you're not getting, like, I mean, the research is invalidated almost immediately. So the great thing was that Google was able to give us the money for the phones. So Google gave us an unrestricted donation into UCL, which means that technically I could spend money on anything, but we have spent it on phones. And then we can buy mobile phones with that money, and we don't have to track them. I just trust people. We give out the phones with internet for a year, and afterwards we track for 6 months how they use things. There's various levels of interviews, and that's it. They get to keep the phone at the end of it, and everyone's happy, right? So that's where that study has led to. So sometimes these small studies, you know, you keep advocating for them because you need a bigger pot of funding, and luckily sometimes that comes along. And so actually I had some slides which I've got to add in about what we're doing with that study, but I can show you at the end, like at the tutorial bit if you want to see. But we paid for a piece of software that sits on your phone that will track what you use your phone for. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to track, like if you phone a person, we don't know that you phone a person. We just know that you spent 2 hours on voice calls, you spent 3 hours on YouTube, you spent 2 hours on social media. You know, the sort of breakdown that you get on your phone usage, we will get to know that level of data. And then on top of it, we have these WhatsApp groups where people share things, and they're sort of set up in pods with local research partners. And so that's now kicked off in India with IIT Bangalore. And we are about to go live in Brazil and Kenya. So the idea is to track three different countries, and we've split it. So one of the big decisions on that was, you know, the questions we had at the beginning, how do you pick people, right? So in an ideal world, you might say, well, really you need to look at people in the rural areas because they're the least connected and everything else. But actually, they're also the hardest to get to, and they're really difficult, and it's really varied. And what we need for this study is we need to get the biggest impact so that we can then get more funding to do other populations and also the wider things. So this is a stepping stone. So we've decided to look at only visually impaired people and hearing impaired people, and only people who live in cities. And that's a limitation, but it's also a strength of the study because it means we will probably get to keep many more of the participants, so we'll get more data, which will help us make the argument, which will then hopefully open up more research opportunities. And so these are the questions that we're answering. How do people with disabilities use mobile phones in their everyday life? How does having access to a mobile phone impact the quality of life of people? How do data plans affect the use of mobile phones? That question actually has pretty much been cut now. Initially, we had the idea that 50% of the people would have data plans and 50% of the people wouldn't have data plans. But as we progressed, I just convinced everybody that we can't just, like, we have to give people data plans. Like, I just feel like we can't give, I just felt like it was going to be unethical. So we've scrapped that, and really we're just going to see what do people use with data plans. In what way does the mobile phone use, replicate, or replace other forms of assistive technology? So we want to know, when are they using, say, for example, screen reader or talkback or something like that? And how do people with disabilities are supported in acquiring the digital skills? So at the moment, with Google and IIT Bangalore, we've developed a training package of digital skills. And so the idea at the moment is that we deliver initial training. So you get to learn how to use the screen reader if you're blind. You get to know some basic magnifying functions, some basic talkback functions. But then some of the more advanced functions, it's too much to give you all in one day. And we can only really pay for everyone to come in once because it gets quite expensive if you've got 800 people traveling in and out. So then what we end up doing is we give people, we have WhatsApp training. So we just, every week we're sending out a little, this is a little video on how to use this. And then they have a local contact that they can contact for support if they want to learn more about that. And so, yeah, how do we promote the feasibility and sustainability of programs and initiatives for getting people mobile phones? So that's that. I was going to just quickly, if I'm honest, it's mainly because I read the breakdown and I realised that we had said we would mention ethics. So last night I quickly put together 5 or 6 slides on ethics because I thought, well, we said we would do it, so I should mention it. I think I've mentioned some of it already, but just a few things. Audience participation. What does ethical mean to you, just generally?
That the participants don't feel like they've been used.
Yeah, that's a good. So we don't want to use people generally. Individual dignity. Yeah, of the participant. Yeah, yeah. So we must make people feel comfortable and try to not emphasize differences or things like this, yeah.
Sometimes we will be expecting some kind of answers. They'll be giving some different answers. We will be trying to reframe our question in such a way that the answers come to our biased questions.
Yeah.
So that should be avoided.
Yeah, it's very difficult. It's so hard to overcome our biases, especially if we've designed a technology, especially if you've spent like a year and a half and you love it and it's just your baby and you've spent like days in the lab making the material work or getting that particular sensor to work, and there was like those 6 months you spent debugging bits of code and now it has a beautiful dashboard, and then the person's saying, well, the dashboard is useless, nobody uses the dashboard, and you're like, no, the dashboard is everything, you've missed the point. Look at the dashboard again, you're obviously looking at the wrong thing. But no, yeah, you have to be careful, and sometimes it's useful to role play it before you go. So sometimes, especially with master's students, before I let them loose on disabled people, I'll get them to role play their interview or role play the questions just with a classmate, and you know, the classmate can say, you know, stop telling me what to say. I didn't mean that. So you can kind of just notice it yourself, but you can also do it with body language. So one of the other things is like noticing, like being aware of, yeah, like if you're giving me an answer and I'm just like I mean, or I just suddenly sort of I get defensive, I fold my arms, or I look away like I'm a bit bored, or I sort of start doing something, you know, you have to be careful because sometimes you can just have a thing that you do, like that you.
Happens nowadays when this mobile phone and voice recorder comes, all this audience participation, they switch on the thing and they just keep it in the on mode. They don't show the required body language.
Yeah.
Parallel works go on.
Yeah, and you get a lot. I mean, you get that a lot with students. I mean, it's quite interesting teaching sometimes to a room of people that are clearly just on Instagram. So all of those things are absolutely valid. So at the very top level, I've not made this specific for any geography. I've made it quite generic. You just want to make sure you do no harm. Like really, and so, you know, if you're talking about actually running the experiments, but at some point you'll also be in charge of other people that run experiments. You might have a team, for example, and at that point you also have to worry about the people doing the work, right? So it might be the case that a participant gets, like if you're working with people with dementia, for example, they can have wild mood swings sometimes and get very angry about something. And so if you have a participant who's not used to dealing with people who are angry, or you might not know it, but they might have suffered some sort of trauma in their past where something happened to them, where if somebody gets angry, they get very scared. You also have to think about those kind of things, like how are you going to protect people? Or if you trigger, like if you're talking about very delicate things, like if somebody needs emotional support after something, what are you going to do? How are you going to do that? Because harm can be both physical and psychological, right? So we want to do no harm. We know that AT can have profound effects on the lives of people with disability, and we want to ensure that entrepreneurial or innovation or research activities don't compromise ethical treatment of people with disabilities. So we have to temper that enthusiasm we have, but this is the best thing. Look, I've made this thing for you. Isn't it brilliant? With the fact that it might not be brilliant at all, but also that it could do harm, and we might not even know harm. So as an example, I wonder sometimes, and this is me being a bit left field, but I wonder sometimes, the World Health Organization, I have to sign a letter whenever I do anything with the World Health Organization. I had to find somebody at the top of UCL, the chief operating officer, to sign a letter when we became a collaborating centre to state that UCL does not invest in arms or tobacco. If you have anything to do with arms or tobacco, you're not allowed to do anything with the World Health Organization, because they are absolutely, they know that those things kill people. It's proven. Smoking kills people, and it's proven that arms kills people, so we're not allowed to do anything else. But increasingly, I think social media is causing so many mental health problems that I really do wonder, at what point will we get to a point where some forms of social media will be like part of this declaration? It will be like guns, cigarettes, social media, right? But but you didn't know, right? So the person who invented filters on, say, TikTok, they maybe didn't expect that to have a really damaging effect on most teenage people in, say, North America. That wasn't their intention, was it? They just thought, look, I've made this thing that turns you into a cat, also makes you look a bit thinner, isn't it funny, right? So a lot of times we can create things, and they have unintended consequences that we might not know about. So we need to get informed consent from people. So nobody sets out really to do harm unless you decide to invade a country or something. Like normally, we're not trying to do any harm. And so when harm is done, it really is accidental, and it normally could have been prevented if you'd thought about it enough ahead of time. But we get history of devices littering things. I find one of the funniest ones that if you buy a cup of coffee, and this started in the United States, but if you buy, I've got two really good United States examples here. One is a cup of coffee. If you buy a cup of coffee, it will have a warning on it that says, contents is hot. Warning, contents is hot. And that's because somebody got a hot coffee, a black coffee from McDonald's drive-thru, put it between her legs, drove off, it spilt, she burnt herself, she successfully sued McDonald's. That meant McDonald's and everybody else gave you warnings, so that it then became your responsibility that the coffee was hot, right? Another example, which is less funny, is microwaves, I think in Canada, United States, carry a warning that they're not suitable for small animals. After an older woman whose cat used to sit on like an aga, like to dry themselves, thought it would be a good idea to put the cat in the microwave. Bad idea. So my point is that the microwave person didn't think somebody was going to put a cat in it, did they? And the person that decided disposable cups didn't think someone wouldn't realise the contents was hot, but also potentially didn't realise just how much waste they were going to generate over the lifetime of their invention of this cup. So we need to consider the possibility of negative effects of use. If we do informed consent, it's non-negotiable in research. You have to get it. It means to give users enough information, plus or minus, to decide to take part. So you have to, it's difficult. So an example of the Cabrera study, it was a nightmare to get ethics approval for that study, and we got ethics approval in UCL, and then we got ethics approval in University of Nairobi. And at every point, the ethics people had got us to add more clauses to the information sheet so that people would really know the full risks and the full risks. But the information sheet then had to be translated into Kiswahili, and then from Kiswahili into Braille. I'm not joking, the information sheet was that thick. There's one sentence was an entire page. And so you have to wonder, did people really remember the entire sentence? Like, were they really giving informed consent? Like, we ended up having to, because obviously we had to do that process, and people had to give a fingerprint or a thumbprint or sign a name if they could, or even give an audio, yes or no, that we could record. But we also took it upon ourselves once we realised, because when we did that test day with Gabrielle, we were like, oh my God, this is awful. Like, I can't believe we've done this. And then after that, we thought, well, we're going to have to give a verbal summary, because I don't think people are going to understand. And like, some of the words were so convoluted. They were like really long legal speak, which somebody living in Cabrera is not going to understand. So trying to get the right level so that you're imparting the details. And that might mean having, because I now fight with ethics. I'm like, no, we're not adding that. I've said it in this way because these people will understand this. I've tested this sentence with this population. They understand that. Nobody understands your sentence, so they can't give informed consent. So they're only really required in research. not in what I would call business as usual. So if you get into a company side of things, if you start to do a spin out, or even if you're just doing design in your lab, there is a point at which you might have some informal feedback. So if you have true co-design with some 2 or 3, so for the Cilia project, we've had 2 or 3 blind people that have helped us along the way. And as we're going, we might just show them a couple of like samples and just say, which one feels right to you? And then they would give us a bit of feedback. Now at that point, we're not putting them under any harm. They know the project well, and we're just getting some, we don't need to get informed consent. They know what they're doing, and we're never going to write that up as a formal study. It's just getting some quick thoughts. Does that make sense? So you can do some studies. And also when you're beginning to design a study, there is public participation studies guidelines. So at the beginning of trying to do, for example, some clinical work, you can, if you're not changing the clinical pathway, you don't necessarily need ethical approval, but you can go in, you can observe how things are done, you can ask people their opinion on the current situation. And so under some NHS ethics, in the UK anyway, you can study some things while you're sort of co-designing what the experiment would be with people, right? So that you can get away with it like that. Yep. So you used to ask people if people are able to give informed consent. And one of the big things about informed consent is what that we do with their data. So there's 2 different things when you want to run a study. You need to get approval for collecting the data. You need to make sure you're storing that person's data securely. And you need to make sure that if it gets hacked or you lose it or somebody makes a mistake, it's as far as possible anonymized. So most things are pseudo-anonymized, as in they have a participant number. So you could always track all the data that belongs to that participant. You don't know their name or their address or where they live. And so that information, that participant number information, along with the other details, should be kept separate. It's a really hot topic at the moment, especially in the UK. Everyone's terrified of data protection because there's a new law. I think it's 8% of GDP. So if one of my experiments, if the data leaks, then UCL can be sued for 8% of their profit. So it goes on the whole organization. So people are very worried about it because it's a small data breach could lead to a massive case. So there are normally protocols that you have to follow. So a classic example is if I send an email and it contains some participant data in it, and I am meant to be sending it to Sujatha, which is approved, and I'm sending you the link for you to get and we've got data approval between those 2 countries. And for whatever reason, as I'm writing your email address, a different Sujatha goes into the email address. And I've now sent this data, which if I hadn't password protected it, say to somebody in Japan. I have just broken loads of rules, like loads of things have happened that are a problem. It's gone into a different geography, which is a problem. If it's not password protected, the data is a leak, right? I immediately have to report that to the data protection officer at UCL. I then have to say what I've done to mitigate it. So obviously I'm going to immediately email somebody and say, like I'm really sorry. If the data is password protected and only available to certain people, and you send that in a different email, then obviously the risk is mitigated, right? Because you don't think you're going to make the same mistake twice. So if you're sending it, say, I've done this, it is a breach, but it's data protected, it's password protected, the data hasn't been used, the person has deleted the email, they've said they've deleted the email. I've now subsequently moved the data, so it can't, it's now in this other folder and I've now resent the thing. It will just go down as like, yeah, it's okay. Like, yes, thank you, we like to track these things, that's okay. If it's actually leaked, then we get into a whole other legal process that we have to go through to retract the data, get it back off servers, prove it's been deleted on servers. There's a whole load of steps, and then we have to write to people. So the first case, I don't have to tell anybody the data has been leaked because it hasn't been leaked. All that's happened is I've nearly shared something. Does that make sense? In the second case, where it wasn't password protected and someone's downloaded it and they've got it, I now need to write every participant and tell them that the data has been leaked and what we are doing with that data and what it means to them and how it's, so it's just it's a massive thing. It's more bad than bad PR. It's a lot of paperwork and it's a proper legal issue. So if you're going into startup world, it can kill you. A data breach, especially in the software world, will just kill your company. People won't invest in you because they will see that you're not going to survive very long. So you must encrypt the data. I would only share fully anonymized data. And so if you want to share data, so if you've got a company, you can share data and you can monetize things, but you can only do that if the data is fully anonymized. You can't do it otherwise. And data ownership is really confusing, so you should get some advice. So we, at UCL, obviously have data protection officers that I go to when things get confusing, and they know every detail. But in companies, you should just get, if you've got a startup, one of the first things I would do is get access to a legal firm that can help you with IP and data protection. And it doesn't take long, they know what they're doing. And then they can set you up with all the right data clauses, they can help you. And also they can for your particular startup or your particular idea, they can help you to know where the major risks are. Does that make sense? So you can protect yourself. Yeah, so the types of data are anonymized data may be from many users, which has been processed by this is a pretend company name, by Algo. Or you can have part processed data, which is anonymized, pseudo-anonymized, or you can have identifiable data about the user. So who owns what? The identifiable, even in those massive terms and conditions that you never read, you're never signing off my identity. Normally, my identity can be transferred, right? So people will be selling data, and we saw that big case with Facebook and Meta and various things going to Cambridge AI and stuff. But people are selling data all the time, and they're selling your data all of the time. Most of the time, that is not identifiable. They could never trace it back to you here, but it's still you. Does that make sense? So it is important just, to know that you own it until you give it away. And it's important if you're trying to build trust with participants, especially vulnerable users, that you're very transparent if you're ever going to give away their data. So if, for example, you suddenly go into a partnership with, let's say, Microsoft, Google, Apple, right? Suddenly you've got this startup and it's suddenly, or one of the big data processors for hearing, that's like one of the big companies, and all of a sudden you've got this patient database that you've got, and it's thousands of people, and you're now going to basically give that data to a big company, then you're going to have to manage that process very carefully. And even in the merger of that and the acquisition of that, the data, how that happens and how people feel that their data is protected is important. So with that, I've got an activity, but we'll save it for after the break, I think, which is when we go into trying to do a co-design session together. I don't think so. I did think about that, like going to the shop at lunch and just getting some paper and pens. I might do that. But you guys don't need to bring anything. I might just nip and get some things. But the idea will be that, just to give you a sneak peek, I've thought about Herex, which turns out is a good example. But I wondered about maybe if they wanted to enter the Indian market, what would that look like? How would we plan a co-design session with a set of stakeholders? And then there's some planning steps of why are we doing it, who are doing it, when or where, what, how we would define roles and things, think about what materials we might develop, and then we've got some templates towards the end that you can fill out, so that you would be able to use as a guide. So what's your goal? What do you hope to get from the co-design? What comes after the co-design workshop? Which stakeholder group are you going to engage with? And sometimes we go through this and then we only pick one. Does that make sense? But we think, okay, well, it might be completely deaf people. It might be, I don't know, people that are going to communicate with people. It might be audiologists or the healthcare profession, and then we break them down. And then you've just got like planning the activities. So you're going to do activity 1, you're going to do task 1, you're going to do the roles of the facilitator. And this sort of helps you break down who's doing what for the thing if you wanted to run it. And then also having somebody that's going to record. So we always say 2 facilitators if you're actually going to run it. So one person's job is to facilitate and one person's job is to record. And that's how you work. And you can swap halfway through, but you need someone that's capturing everything. Otherwise, at the end of it, it will just feel like a big mess. So we have these sort of workshops, things that we can look at together when we come back. If that sounds like fun, and then we can think about, for example, activities. If you want to think more about the different methods, I can chat through any methods if you're not sure about them. Does that sound like a plan?